I have buried a good many things in my 80 years. 2 dogs I cried over, a brother I didn't cry over near enough, and one boss I'd have followed into a burning barn. But the thing I think on most, the thing that comes to me of an evening when the fire's low and my knees ache and the wind walks the eaves of this old bunkhouse, is a wedding nobody in Quill Creek expected, and not one soul thought would last the winter. I was foreman of the 2-bar then, and had been 20 years, which is to say I knew Reuben Calder better than his own shadow knew him. So when I tell you the man I watched ride down off ladder bench that dry September was not a man with marrying on his mind, you can take it for gospel. He hadn't smiled since the spring his wife was put in the ground, and that was 8 years gone. He'd hardened into the kind of man a country makes when it takes everything and offers nothing back, and that country had taken plenty. We were dying of thirst, is the plain truth of it. 3 summers running, the rains had passed us by. Quill Creek itself was down to a dirty trickle you could step across without wetting your boot soles, and every seep and tank and stock pond on the dry side of the ladder hills had cracked to a gray scab. We'd lost near a third of the herd the summer before, and Reuben had stood at the rim of the home pasture watching the buzzards go down on what he'd built his whole life, and he had not said one word. That was the thing about him. The harder he was hit, the quieter he got. By that September he was about as quiet as a tombstone. So there was only one thing in the valley worth talking about, and that was Cold Spring. It came up out of the rock at the head of the Mercer meadow, high on the bench where old Hosea Mercer had homesteaded 40 years before because he was too contrary to settle any place a sensible man would. Cold Spring had never failed in living memory. It came out of the mountain steady as a heartbeat, sweet and so cold it ached your teeth, and it ran down through a stand of cottonwoods into a meadow that should have been the prettiest little outfit in the hills. Should have been. Hosea had let it go to ruin out of pure stinginess, wouldn't spend $1 to keep 2, so the fences sagged and the cabin roof grew moss and the good bottom hay went to weeds. But the spring ran on, never minding the man who owned it. And the man who owned it died that September and left the whole of it, meadow, ruin, cabin, and the one steady spring on the parched side of the hills to his daughter. I'd best tell you about her, because the whole valley got her wrong, and I was no better than the rest for the first while. Her name was Etta. She'd been on that bench since she was a girl, and by the time her father died she was a woman of some 35 years, which the town of Quill Creek had decided made her a spinster, and therefore a thing to be pitied or pestered, and not much regarded either way. She'd kept her father's house and nursed his every ill for 15 years, and Hosea Mercer was a man whose every ill came with a complaint attached and never a thank you to follow. He'd run off the one young man who'd ever come courting, back when Etta was young enough for courting, on the grounds that the fellow would want feeding. He'd kept her up the mountain and out of the way and worked her like a hand and paid her like a daughter, which is to say not at all, and the town saw a plain woman in a faded dress driving a poor wagon to the store twice a month and counting her coins close, and the town decided it knew the whole of her. The town was wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first I knew of any of it was the morning after Hosea's burying, when a stranger came up the 2-bar road in a livery rigged too fine for the country, wearing a suit of clothes that had never seen honest dust until that very ride. He climbed down at the corral where I was doctoring a lame horse and put out a soft hand and gave me a name like a man laying down a winning card. "Asher," he said, "Del Asher. I represent the Cattlemen's Land and Water Company out of the territorial capital." He said the name of the company the way a preacher says the name of glory. "I'm calling on the principal outfits hereabouts on a matter of great mutual benefit. Might I trouble your employer for a quarter-hour of his time?" I'd been at the 2-bar long enough to know my boss didn't have a quarter-hour for any man in a clean suit, but Reuben heard the rig and came out onto the porch and looked the fellow over the way he'd look over a horse he didn't mean to buy. "Say it from there," Reuben told him. "I'm working." Asher's smile never slipped. It was a fine smile. I'll give him that, white and easy and warm as a banker's lie. Of course. I'll be brief. You're a cattleman, Mr. Calder, and a cattleman's only as good as his water. I don't have to tell you what these last summers have cost this valley, but I expect you've heard the old Mercer place changed hands this week. Old Mercer died, Reuben said. Nothing changed hands, his daughters got it. Just so. Asher spread his hands like a man explaining a kindness. A young woman alone, with a worthless meadow and no means to work it, and the one asset in this valley that any man with sense would pay a fortune to control. Cold Spring. My company is prepared to purchase the Mercer holding outright the land, and more to the point, the water, and to lease that water back to the established outfits of this valley at a fair seasonal rate. You'd never lack again, Mr. Calder. You'd water that herd of yours straight through to the next century. All it asks of you is that you let me handle the unpleasant business of dealing with the woman. I watched my boss's jaw set, and what's it ask of her? That she be sensible, Asher said smoothly, and take a good price for a thing she cannot possibly use and go live like a lady somewhere kinder to her than these mountains have been. I'd call it a mercy. He produced a card and held it out, and Reuben did not take it, so he set it on the porch rail like he was leaving an offering. Think on it. I'll be lodged at the Quill Creek Hotel a few weeks while I bring the valley round. A thing like this wants patience. He climbed back into his rig, touched his hat, and gave us that warm white smile once more. Good outfits like yours shouldn't have to live and die by another man's water, or another woman's whim. And he drove off down the bench with the dust hanging gold behind him. Reuben stood a long while looking at the card on the rail. Then he picked it up, read it once, and tore it twice and let the wind take it. You don't trust him, I said. I've watered cattle out of Cold Spring with old Hosea's leave for 30 years, he said. Every drought that spring kept this valley breathing. And now a man in a town suit wants to put a gate on it and a price on it and sell it back to us by the season. He spat into the dust. No, I don't trust him. A man comes telling you he wants to do you a kindness, and the kindness is to take a thing away from a woman who just buried her father. That's not a kindness, Asa. That's a wolf with a Sunday hat on. It was the longest speech I'd heard out of him in a year, and I figured that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. He brooded on it 3 days. I knew the signs. He got quieter, which I wouldn't have thought possible, and he rode the dry rim of the home pasture of an evening and looked down at the meadow on the bench, green as a promise around that one steady spring, while everything on his side of the line stood dust-colored and panting. On the third evening he came in late and stood in the bunkhouse door with his hat in his hand, which was a thing he never did, and he said, Asa, tell me a man's not a fool for what he's thinking. I can't do that, I said, till he tells me what he's thinking. He turned the hat round in his hands a couple times. I'm thinking of riding up to the Mercer place tomorrow, he said, and asking that woman to marry me. I near swallowed my pipe. You haven't spoke 10 words to that woman in your life. I know it. You haven't spoke 10 words to any asterisk woman since Sarah died. I know that too. He looked at me steady, and there was no foolishness in his face, only a hard, tired figuring, the way he'd look at a sum that wouldn't come out. It's not, Asa, it's not what you're grinning about. I'm not a green boy gone soft over a girl. Asher's going to get that water. He's patient and he's smooth and he's got a company's money behind him. And that woman's got nothing, no hands, no cash to work the place, no man to stand for her, and a whole valley too thirsty to take her part against a fellow promising them all a drink. He'll wear her down. He'll buy her out by Christmas, and then there'll be a gate and a tollman on Cold Spring. And we'll pay through the nose for water her father gave us free. And the day that company decides the 2 bars not worth the trouble, will dry up and blow away. And a wedding fixes that. Man can't court her water, Reuben said, but a man can marry her, and then the water's joined to the 2 bar by law, and no land company on God's earth can buy it out from under us. It's the only fence I can build that'll hold. He set his jaw. I'd not cheat her. I'd offer her a square bargain, my name and my protection and a third of the increase, and she keeps her land, keeps her deed, keeps her own say in her own house, and I'd ask nothing of her she didn't care to give. In name only. A business between two grown people who both got something to lose. I'll tell you, I argued with him half the night. I said it was a cold thing to do to a woman. I said she'd say no and he'd be a laughingstock. I said you couldn't build a marriage on a stock tank no matter how steady it ran. He heard me out the way he always did, and at the end he just put his hat on and said, "I'm not building a marriage, Asa. I'm building a fence. Now I'm going to bed." And he went. But I'll tell you something else that I didn't say to him and wouldn't have, being a hired man and not a fool. In 8 years I had never once seen Reuben Calder look at a thing the way he'd looked down at that green meadow on the bench. He'd called it water. I'd watched his face, and it had not been a thirsty man's face. It had been the face of a man who'd forgotten what living things looked like and had just been reminded. He rode up the next morning, and I rode along, because somebody had to hold the horses and because I wasn't about to miss it. The Mercer cabin sat back in the cottonwoods with the spring chuckling along behind it, and even run down the way it was, you could see what it might be. There was a woman in the dooryard splitting kindling when we came up, a tall woman in a gray dress gone soft with washing, with her sleeves shoved up and her dark hair pinned back plain, and she set the axe in the block and stood and watched us come without any flutter at all. That was the first thing I noticed about Etta Mercer, before I noticed anything else. She watched two men ride into her yard with the calm of a woman watching whether she'd already decided she could live through. "Mr. Calder," she said when we'd stopped. She knew him by sight then. "If you've come about the water, you can save your breath and your animal both. The valley's worn a path to my door this week, and I've sent every one of them down it again." "I expect you have," Reuben said. "Mr. Asher from the land company's been twice. He's got a way of talking that makes selling sound like Sunday school." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm not selling, Mr. Calder. My father held this water 40 years and let half the men in this valley use it free, and I aim to do the same. You can run your stock to Cold Spring same as you always have, and welcome, and you needn't buy me out nor lease it, nor send a smiling man to do your asking." She picked the axe back up. "Now if that's all." "It's not all," Reuben said. She waited. And he told her, right there in the dooryard, plain as a fence post, with me holding the horses and wishing I was any place else on earth. He told her about the drought and the company and the gate and the tollman that would come. He told her that her good intentions about the free water wouldn't survive the first time Asher offered the valley a guaranteed drink for cash, because thirsty men don't take a free uncertain thing over a paid certain one, and that the day she ran short herself, she'd have no man to stand for her and no money to fight a company in a territorial court, and they'd grind her down to a sale whether she willed it or not. He laid it out cold, the whole of it, the way he saw it coming, and I watched her face, and her face changed, because she was hearing a man tell her the truth instead of selling her a kindness, and she'd plainly not had much of that in her life. And then he said it. "I'm a widower," he said. "I run the 2-bar off ladder bench and it's drying up, and I've no more wish to be married than you've a wish to sell. But if you and I were to wed, the law would join your water to my land, and no company could touch it, and there'd be a man and an outfit to stand for you when the trouble comes, and it's coming. I'd offer you a square bargain, Miss Mercer, and no soft words on it, because I'm no good at soft words and you've had a bellyful of them this week from better liars than me. You'd keep your land. You'd keep your deed in your own name. You'd keep your own say under your own roof, and a third part of everything the joining brings, set down in writing before a lawyer so it'd hold. And I'd ask nothing of you that you didn't freely care to give. In name only, if that's your wish, for as long as that's your wish. A bargain between two people who'd both rather keep what's theirs than lose it to a man in a clean suit. I have heard a good many men propose marriage, one way and another, across a long life. I never heard one do it like that, and I expect I never will again. Etta Mercer stood holding her axe and looked at him a long, long while. The spring chuckled behind the cabin. A jay scolded down in the cottonwoods. Somewhere her father's old milk cow lowed to be let out. And at last she set the axe down in the block again, careful, and she said a thing I've remembered word for word every day of my life since. "In all my 35 years, Mr. Calder," she said, "you are the first man to ride up this hill and offer me anything at all without first telling me how lucky I'd be to take it." She studied him. "You've offered me a bad bargain plainly instead of a worse one with sugar on it. I find I'd rather have the plain one, a breath. I'll think on it tonight and you'll have my answer in the morning. And whatever it is, it'll be mine. Not the valley's, not my father's ghost's, not yours. Mine." "That's all I'd want it to be," Reuben said. She nodded once. "Then good day to you, and Mr. Calder." He turned his horse and looked back. "Send the smiling man no more. I can deal with my own wolves." We rode down the bench in the long light, and neither of us said anything for a mile. Then I couldn't hold it any longer. "She's nothing like the valley says," I said. "No," Reuben said, "she's not." And that was all I got out of him the whole way home, but he rode the last of it looking straight ahead, and there was something gone out of his shoulders that had been set in them 8 years. She sent word down the next morning by a boy off a neighboring place. 3 words on a scrap of paper in a hand that was better than mine and steadier than most men's. Yes, my terms, and under it set out in a neat list that the deed stayed Mercer, that the lawyer's paper be drawn before any vows, that she kept the cabin and the garden ground as her own, and last I remember Reuben read it twice, that you not pretend before the valley or before me to feel what is not felt. I have had enough pretending for one life. Let it be honest, even if it is only honest about being a bargain. "She drives a hard trade," I said. "She drives a fair one," Reuben said, and folded the paper into his breast pocket and kept it there, and so far as I know kept it there the rest of his days. They were married in October by the circuit preacher in the Quill Creek meeting house, with the lawyer's paper signed first and the vows said after, and I stood up as Reuben's witness, because he hadn't another friend in the world to ask. The valley came, of course. The valley would walk a mile in a hailstorm to gawk at something, and the valley whispered, because the valley had had her settled in its mind as the plain Mercer spinster who'd dry up alone on her father's ruin, and here she was wedding the richest land in the hills, water and all. They said he'd married a stock tank. They said she'd snared a widower with her father barely cold. Etta heard all of it, I'm sure, the way she heard everything, plain and unflinching, and she stood up in the only good dress she owned and said her vows in a clear voice and looked nobody in the valley in the eye but the man she was marrying, and when it was done she did not weep nor smile nor reach for him. She just turned and faced the room of whisperers with her chin level, and the whispering quit. There was a kind of dignity to her that shut people up. I'd seen it on good horses and a few great men, and never once on a woman before, and it sat on Etta Mercer like she'd been born wearing it. She moved her few things down to the 2-bar that week, and we hauled her father's leavings down after, and the Mercer cabin was shut up, and Cold Spring became, by the law of the territory, the water of the 2-bar outfit and beyond the reach of any company on earth. The fence Reuben meant to build was built. He'd got what he rode up the hill for. And then the strangest thing happened, which was that having got it, neither one of them seemed to know quite what to do with the rest of their lives. I'll be honest about that first stretch, because it was no fairy story. It was 2 walled-up people sharing a house and being scrupulously, painfully fair with one another. She took the kitchen and the garden and ran them well, and asked him nothing. He took the range and the stock and ran them, and told her nothing he didn't have to, and they passed in the dog trot like polite strangers, and ate their supper across the long table making such talk as the weather and the cattle allowed, which up the latter hills in a dry fall is not much talk at all. She slept in the room that had been Sarah's sewing room. He slept where he'd always slept. In name only, just as the bargain said, and you'd have thought a man would be content with that, having said it was all he wanted. But I'd watch him at supper of an evening, when she'd get up to fetch a thing, and his eyes would follow her across the room and then jerk back down to his plate when she turned. And I'd watch her, when he'd come in off the range cold and tired and not say a word, set a plate in front of him a little better than the bargain called for, a wedge of dried apple pie she'd not had to make, a second helping pressed on him without his asking. They were each of them watching the other and pretending not to, the way two cats will sit on opposite ends of a porch and refuse to admit they've noticed one another's there. The garden cracked it open. I might as well say it was the garden, for it surely was. Behind the two-bar house there was a fenced patch of ground that Sarah Calder had broke and planted her first year there, more than 10 years back, a kitchen garden, vegetables and herbs, and along the south fence, a row of old roses she'd carried up the mountain as cuttings from her mother's place east. When Sarah died, Reuben had nailed the gate shut. Not torn it out, not let the stock in to graze it down, nailed it shut, and let it run to ruin, the way old Hosea had let the meadow run, except Hosea did it from stinginess and Reuben did it from grief, and grief is a stingier thing than stinginess ever was. 8 years that garden had stood behind that nailed gate, the roses gone to briar and the beds gone to thistle, and not one of us hands had ever so much as mentioned it, because to mention it was to mention Sarah, and to mention Sarah was to watch the man go gray and quiet for a day. Etta Mercer was on the place a month before she pried the gate open. I came round the house one morning in November, and there she was inside the fence on her knees in the dead beds, sleeves shoved up the way they'd been the first day, pulling thistle and laying it in a barrow, her hands all scratched from the briar, working that ruined ground like it was a sick thing she meant to nurse back. And I stopped cold, because I knew whose garden it was, and I knew the gate had been nailed, and I knew what Reuben would do when he saw, and I purely did not want to be standing there when he did it. He came round the house behind me not a minute later, and he saw her, and he stopped the way I'd stopped, and the color went out of his face the way I'd known it would. Etta sat back on her heels and looked at him through the fence. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. "This is good ground gone to waste," she said quietly. "There's roses under all this briar still trying to live. Somebody loved this garden once and built it with care, and it's a hard thing to watch a thing built with love go back to weeds for want of 1 hour's tending." She let that sit a moment. "I'll put it back if you'll let me, Mr. Calder. Not to take it from her, I'd never. To honor it. A garden's meant to be kept. A thing somebody loved is meant to be kept living, not nailed up in the dark." She held his eye. "But it's your ground and her garden, and if you want the gate nailed again, I'll nail it myself and never speak of it. You only have to say." I have wondered since how a woman who'd been told her whole life that she had no eye for tenderness could see so clean into a man she'd hardly spoken to. I think it's because she'd had so much taken from her, and watched it taken, that she knew exactly what a thing looked like when its keeper had quit on it out of pain. She'd recognized that nailed gate the way one wounded creature knows another. Reuben stood there a long while. His hand was on the fence post, white-knuckled. And then, and I will swear to this on any Bible you set in front of me, his shoulders came down the way they had on the road that first evening, and he said, in a voice I'd not heard out of him since the spring Sarah died, low and rough, "She'd not want it weeds. She used to say a garden left to itself was a sin against good ground." He swallowed. "Keep it living. I'd take it kindly if you'd keep it living." And he turned and walked off to the corrals and didn't come back to the house all that day. But that evening at supper he ate his pie, and when she got up to fetch the coffee, he said, not looking at her, "There's a trowel and a hand fork of hers in the harness room. Good steel. She'd want them used." And Etta said, "Thank you. I'll mind them well." And that was the whole of the conversation, and it was the most either of them had ever given the other, and you could have heard a pin drop in that kitchen for the weight of it. That was the first thaw. After that there were more. The snow came early and hard that year, the way it does in the latter hills when a country's been dry, like the sky's been hoarding it, and lets it all go at once. By the first week of December we were socked in deep. The bench road drifted shut, the cattle hauled down into the home pastures where the snow gave us what the rain hadn't, and the whole 2-bar drawn in tight against the white. There's a particular kind of long that a mountain winter is. The days are short and the nights are forever, and a household snowed in together either grows close or grows to hate the sight of each other. There's no middle road. I had my doubts which way ours would go. It grew close. Lord, how it grew close. It was the small things, it always is. She'd mend his coat without being asked and lay it back over his chair, and he'd notice. And the next time he was to town through a break in the weather he'd come back with a length of blue cloth she'd looked at twice in the store and not bought, and set it on the table by her place and say nothing. And she'd hold it a moment and say, "Thank you," so quiet I near didn't hear, and make herself a dress of it that she wore Sundays the rest of that winter and looked, I'll say it plain, handsome in. For she was a handsome woman, was Etta, once a body troubled to look, with a strong, clean-boned face and dark eyes that didn't miss a thing, and a way of going still and listening that drew you to her without her lifting a finger. The valley had called her plain because the valley had only ever seen her tired and overworked in counting coins. The valley had never seen her warm. It was the colt, too. We had a young horse that winter, a leggy blue roan out of a good mare, that no man on the place could do a thing with. He'd come in green and got handled rough by a hand we'd since let go, and he was head-shy and spooked, and would strike at a man soon as look at him, and Reuben had about decided to sell him for what we could get before he killed somebody. Etta took to going out to the corral of an evening, just standing at the fence in the cold with her hands in her apron, not reaching, not talking even, just standing, an hour at a time, while the colt watched her from the far side wide-eyed, night after night. Reuben thought it foolishness and said so once, and she said, "He's only afraid. He's been hurt by hands and learned hands mean hurting. You can't argue a creature out of fear, you can only stand near it long enough that it learns you mean it none." And inside a month that roan was eating out of her palm and following her round the corral like a dog, and Reuben stood watching it through the rails one cold evening, and I watched him watching, and I tell you the man's face. There was a thing happening in the man's face that he didn't have words for and wouldn't have spoke if he had. Because he'd been a hurt creature too long, you see. And here was a woman standing near, night after night, asking nothing, reaching for nothing, just being there at the fence in the cold until the hurt thing learned she meant it no harm. She did to that man exactly what she did to that colt, and I don't believe she planned a particle of it. It was only her nature. She was a tender, watchful, patient soul that had had nobody to spend itself on for 35 years but a sour old man who never thanked her, and turned loose on a grieving man and a frightened horse and a ruined garden. That nature of hers went to work like spring goes to work on snow. They got to talking, those long nights. I'd come up to the house for this or that, and find them not at the long table being polite but drawn in by the kitchen stove, her with her mending and him with a bit of harness, talking low. He told her about Sarah, finally. I heard the tale of it one night, him saying how she'd died of the fever the same week as the baby, and how he'd quit on everything that wasn't cattle because cattle didn't die on you in a way that broke a man, or so he'd thought till the drought, and how he'd come to believe a man only got the one good thing, and he'd had his and buried it. And Etta didn't pet him over it nor weep at him. She just listened the way she listened to everything, full and still, and then she said, "A man who builds a garden and nails the gate when he loses the gardener isn't a man who only had one good thing. He's a man with so much good in him it near killed him to lose the one he'd spent it on. That's not an empty well," Reuben called her. "That's a full one with a stone rolled over it." And he sat there a long time after that, and I went on out to the bunkhouse, because some things a hired man's got no business hearing the end of. And she told him about herself, which I heard more of, because she told it plainer and with less heartbreak in it, the way a body tells a thing they've made their peace with. About 15 years up the bench with Hosea. About the young man, Tom Eddy his name was, who'd come courting when she was 20 and been run off because he'd want feeding, and married a girl from down the valley instead and had 6 children and a good farm, and how she'd watched that whole life she might have had go by from up the mountain. About how she'd quit hopping for anything of her own somewhere around 30 and settled into being a thing that was used, the way a good axe is used and not loved, and how it had near surprised her to find she could still look at a length of blue cloth in a store and want it for herself, after all those years of wanting nothing because wanting only made the not having worse. "I'd forgot I was a person and not a tool," she told him once. It took burying him to remember. I felt low about that for a while, that I had to be glad of his dying to get my own life. But then I thought, no. He took my life from me a thread at a time for 15 years. There's no shame in taking it back however it comes. And Reuben said, "There's no shame in it." And then he said, after a while, "I'm glad you took it back. I'm glad of where it brought you." And there was a silence in that kitchen that wasn't a polite silence anymore. Now I'd be telling it false if I let you think the smiling man had given up and rode off. Del Asher had not given up. A wolf in a Sunday hat doesn't give up. He only waits for a softer moment. He'd been thwarted, you see. The marriage had locked Cold Spring to the 2-bar past any buying, and that had put a hole clean through the middle of his scheme. For I'd learned by then, the way a man learns things in a small valley, that Asher's Land and Water Company was Asher and 2 silent partners back east, and the whole of their plan had hung on getting hold of that one never-fail spring, and then leasing the valley's own water back to it at whatever the traffic would bear. With Cold Spring gone out of reach, the rest of his scheme was so much paper. He couldn't squeeze a valley he didn't hold the water on. So he changed his tune, and his tune got ugly, though he kept the smile on it. It started with talk in town. Word came up to us through the hands and the store that Asher had taken to remarking, over glass at the hotel, what a curious quick thing the Calder marriage had been. A rich widower and a poor spinster wed inside a month of her father's death, water and all, and wasn't it strange? And a man did wonder in a marriage like that whether all was as the law liked it. He never said a flat thing you could call him on. He only wondered out loud, where men could hear him, and let the wondering do its work. A marriage of convenience, he'd say, gentle as butter. Why, the territory had a particular suspicion of those. A marriage entered into not in good faith but only to lock up a property, to dodge a sale, to defraud. The courts called that a fraud on the law, you know, and a marriage proven a sham could be set aside and the property with it. He wasn't saying it was so. He was only saying it was the sort of thing a careful man would look into. And if it were so, why, then the water might be for sale after all, mightn't it, once the law had untangled it? He was only wondering. It was a clever, low piece of work. Because it was half true, you see, it had been a marriage of convenience, struck plainly for the water, with a lawyer's paper to prove the cold bones of it, and they'd both said the words out loud to one another and to me. If Asher could get a territorial judge to believe the thing was a pure sham, a fraud with no marriage in it at all, he might just get it set aside, and the water loosed back onto the market, and his scheme back from the dead. And there was paper in a lawyer's safe in Quill Creek that, read cold by a hostile man, said in black ink that it had been a bargain and nothing more. Reuben heard the talk and went still and dangerous, the way he did, and would have ridden to town and laid hands on the man, which is exactly what Asher would have wanted. A hot-tempered husband making a scene only proves there's something raw to poke at. Etta stopped him. She put her hand flat on his chest in the dog trot, the first time I ever saw her touch him of her own move, and she said, "No, you go down there with your fists up and you've handed him his proof. A man fights that hard for a thing because the thing's real or because the thing's a fraud, and he'll tell the judge it's the second. We don't fight him hot. We fight him cold, and we fight him true." And Reuben looked down at her hand on his chest, and the fight went out of him, and he said, "All right. How?" "Let me think on it," she said. And she thought on it 3 days, the way she thought on everything, and on the 3rd day she had it. Asher came to the 2-bar himself, in the end, in a January thaw, in a fresh hired cutter with a robe over his knees, and his smile was as warm and white as ever, and underneath it now there was a thing showing through that hadn't shown the first day. A meanness, a hunger that had got tired of being patient. We were all three out front when he drove up. By arrangement, for Etta had said, "Let him come to us, and let him say it to our faces with witnesses by, and let me handle it." So Reuben stood on the porch with his thumbs in his belt and his face like a closed door, and I stood off to the side with my hat in my hands trying to look like furniture, and Etta stood at the top of the steps in her blue Sunday dress with her hands folded, calm as cold spring itself, and let the man do his talking. He talked a good while. He was good at it, even gone mean. He spoke of how it pained him to come on such an errand, how he held them both in the highest regard, how the world was a hard place for a woman alone, and how he feared this hasty marriage had been forced on her by circumstance, by a clever neighbor who'd seen a way to lock up a fortune in water and used a grieving girl to do it. He spoke directly to Etta then, all gentleness, the wolf's hat well on. "You needn't fear him, my dear," he said. "The law protects women from being so used. A marriage got up only to seize a property, why, that's no marriage, that's a swindle the courts will undo in a heartbeat and put the property back in honest hands. Your asterisk hands. You'd be a free woman again and a rich one, for my company would pay you handsomely and you'd never want again, not a dollar, not a worry, not a long mountain winter of cooking for a cold man who married your stock tank and not yourself. You'd be free of him. You have only to say the word and tell a judge the truth of how this marriage came about, and I'll see to all the rest. The truth, that's all the law asks. You signed a paper, didn't you, that says it was only a bargain? The truth's already written down, my dear. You'd only have to own it." I held my breath, for he'd built it cunning. He'd offered her money and freedom and a way out of a cold house and the comfort of being the wronged innocent, and all she had to do to take it was say a true thing, that the marriage had begun as a bargain. The paper said so. She'd written it herself. Etta let him finish. She let the quiet sit a moment after the way she did, until the man's smile got a little fixed waiting on her. Then she said, in that clear plain voice that shut up whole meeting houses, "Mr. Asher, you've told me a great deal of truth this morning and dressed it so it'd cut the way you wanted. Yes, I signed a paper. Yes, this marriage began as a bargain. Yes, he married my water before he married me. He'd be the first to tell you so, for he's the only honest man who ever rode up my hill." She let that land. "But you've made one mistake, and it's the mistake your kind always makes. You think because a thing began cold it must be cold. You think a marriage is the paper it started on and nothing the people made of it after. You've never built a thing in your life, Mr. Asher, only bought and sold what other folks built. So you don't know, a thing's not what it was when it started. It's what's been done to it since." She took one step down toward him. I came down off that bench, a tool that had been used up and set aside, and a hard, grieving man met me with the only square dealing I'd had in 35 years. And across one long winter, the two of us pulled a dead garden back to life, and gentled a horse no man could touch, and learned each other's hurts in a warm kitchen. And somewhere in there, I couldn't tell you the day, the bargain quit being a bargain. I'd not undo this marriage for all your company's money, Mr. Asher, and not because I fear a judge or a long winter. I'd not undo it because I'd be undoing the only home I've ever had with the only man who ever saw me asterisk, not my water, not my use, and chose to be glad of it. You came up here to tell me I was being used. Mister, I have been asterisk used. I know exactly what it feels like, and it does not feel like this." She stood square. "Now there's the road. I'll thank you to take it, and tell your silent partners back east that Cold Spring's not for sale, was never for sale, and is married fast and true and willing to this land and this man. And if you breathe one more word in that town about my marriage being a sham, I'll go to the judge myself, of my own free will, and swear before God and the territory exactly what I've just sworn to you. See how your fraud case stands then, with the wronged woman herself telling the judge she'd not be parted from her husband for the world. I have never in my life seen a man so thoroughly beaten by a thing he could not lay a hand on." Asher opened his mouth twice and shut it twice. The smile was gone clean off him. There was just the meanness, naked now and useless, for his whole game had run on her being a wronged and willing victim, and she just told the world to its face that she was a wife. There was no sham to prove. You can't undo a true marriage on the say-so of the bride who swears it's true. He gathered up his robe and his dignity, what was left of it, and he turned the cutter, and he said one last small ugly thing, "You'll regret refusing me. These mountains are hard on the stubborn." And Etta said, "I've survived harder men than you, Mr. Asher, on less. Good day," and he drove off down the bench, and that was the last the valley ever saw of Del Asher, for with the spring locked up his scheme was dead, and a man like that doesn't linger where there's no more money to be had. We stood on the porch and watched the cutter go small down the White Bench Road, and for a while nobody said anything. Then Etta let out a long breath, and I saw her hands were trembling, for she'd been steady as iron the whole time, but it had cost her plenty, standing up to a thing like that, and Reuben saw it too, and he did a thing I'd never once seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He reached out and took her trembling hands in both of his big rough ones, careful as a man handling something he'd thought was lost, and he held them still. "You said," he started and stopped and started again, rough as gravel, "you said somewhere in the winter the bargain quit being a bargain. You said it to him. You said it plain to his face in front of God and Asa and everybody." He looked at her, and there was 8 years' worth of nailed-shut gates swinging open in the man's face. "Did you mean it, or did you only say it to beat him?" And Etta Mercer, who'd been used like a tool and overlooked like a fence post and called plain by a whole valley that never troubled to look. Etta lifted her chin and looked her husband dead in the eye and said, "Reuben Calder, I have never in my life said a thing I didn't mean, and I'm too old to start. I married you for a fence. I'll not pretend otherwise. It was honest, and I'm not ashamed of it. But you brought me roses to fix and a horse to gentle and your dead wife's garden to bring back to life, and you brought me a length of blue cloth because you saw me want it, and you sat in that kitchen and told me about Sarah because you trusted me with it, and not one time, not one single time in this whole long winter, did you ever make me feel like a thing that was being used." Her voice caught, just the once. "I told that man the bargain quit being a bargain. I'll tell you the rest of it that I didn't tell him, for it's none of his and all of yours. I don't rightly know when I started loving you, but I know I do. I know it the way I know that spring'll run when everything else has dried. And I'll not be your wife in name only one more night, Reuben, not because the bargain says I have to, but because I'd rather be your wife in truth than anything else this hard world ever offered me if you'll have me. Not the water, me." I took myself off the porch about then, as quiet as I knew how, and went on down to the bunkhouse, because a man's got no business standing by for the rest of a thing like that. But I looked back the once from the bottom of the steps, and I saw Reuben Calder pull his wife in against his chest in the cold, bright January light, and bow his head down over her dark hair, and I saw his shoulders shake, and I knew the stone was rolled clean off that full well at last, and I went on to the bunkhouse with my own eyes none too dry and let the two of them be. They had near 30 years together after that, and I had the great good fortune to see most of them out, being too old and too stubborn, and too fond of the both of them to go any place else. The drought broke that next summer, as droughts do, and the rains came back, and cold spring ran on the way it always had, never minding the men who'd schemed over it. But by then nobody at the 2-bar much cared whether it was the spring or the rain kept the grass green, for the thing the spring had been wanted for was long since forgot, and the thing it had brought instead was sitting at the head of the long table pouring coffee, and telling Reuben he'd tracked mud in again. They built that outfit up into the best in the latter hills, the two of them, her with her head for sums and her hard fair trading and him with his cattle sense. A real partnership it was, her name and his side by side on every paper, just as she'd held out for. The garden came all the way back, roses and all, and got bigger every year, and folks would come from down the valley just to see it, Sarah Calder's garden that Etta Mercer kept living, and there was never a particle of strangeness in that, For Etta had a way of honoring the dead without being haunted by them that I've not seen the equal of since. They had no children of their own. They'd married late, and that wasn't to be. But they raised up 2 orphan nieces of Sarah's that came west with no one. And those girls grew up calling Etta mother and meaning it, and married well and gave the old folks more grandchildren than they could keep names straight on. And the long table was never empty nor quiet again, as long as the 2 of them lived. And the valley, well, the valley came round, the way a valley does. It quit calling her the plain Mercer spinster who'd snared a widower, because you cannot go on calling a woman plain once you've seen her happy, and you cannot go on saying a woman snared a man once you've watched that man light up like a lamp every time she walks into a room for 30 years. By the end, they called her Mrs. Calder of the 2 Bar, with the kind of respect a hard country gives the people who outlast it, and the same mouths that had whispered at her wedding came to her for doctoring advice and seed roses and 100 small kindnesses, and got them, for she was generous past all reason with everyone but liars and wolves. I asked her once late, when we were both old and Reuben had been gone a year, and she not long for following, whether she ever thought how strange it was that the worst thing in her life, her father dying and leaving her that worn-out ruin, had been the very thing that brought her all the rest. She was sitting in the garden in the evening light with a rose in her lap, and she thought on it the way she thought on everything, full and still and a long while. "I don't call it strange," she said at last. "I call it the way of things. I spent 35 years being a tool a hard man used in a valley overlooked, and I'd have told you I was plain and used up and meant for nothing, because everybody told me so and I'd come to believe them. And then a stone-faced man rode up my hill and offered me a cold, honest bargain about water, and that was the first crack of light, that one square dealing after all that dark." She turned the rose in her old hands. "It wasn't the spring that saved me, Asa. The spring was just what brought him up the hill. It was that he looked at me, not my use, not my water, and saw something there worth the seeing and was glad of it. A whole life I waited for one soul to do that. I'd given up on it, and he gave it to me wrapped up in a business proposition because he didn't know any softer way to come at a thing, the dear stubborn man." She smiled, and the years fell off her when she smiled, the way they always had. "I'd not trade that cold bargain for the warmest courting any girl ever had. It was honest. It was mine, and it turned into the only true thing I ever owned. She's gone now too, this long while, the both of them up on the rise above the garden under 2 plain stones with the roses grown thick around. And I'm the last that remembers how it started. An old foreman in an old bunkhouse with aching knees and a low fire, who stood up as witness once at a wedding the whole valley swore wouldn't last the winter. It lasted 30 years. And if you ever ride the latter hills, up the bench above where Quill Creek used to be, you can still find the spring. It comes out of the rock the same as it always did, sweet and so cold it aches your teeth, steady as a heartbeat, never minding the men who once schemed over it, nor the woman who once held it, nor the long-dead drought that made it worth a fortune. It just runs on, the way good true things do, giving itself away to whoever's thirsty and asking nothing back. I sit by it sometimes of a summer evening, and I think about a tall woman in a gray dress setting an axe down careful in a block, and saying she'd rather have a plain bargain than a sweet lie. And I think she got the best of every deal she ever made. Did Etta Mercer, the plainest, finest, most overlooked woman these hard hills ever failed to see, and got it, in the end, by being the only one with eyes clear enough to know a true thing from a sweet one. The water's still running. That's about all a man can hope to leave behind him in this country, a true thing that keeps on running after he's gone. It's enough, by God it's enough.